I like psychedelics, and I like to study the pharmacology of them.
Eli Lilly acquired Atai Beckley Therapeutics for $3.8 billion. Why did they do that? They bought this company because they have a patented nasal spray of a variation of 5-MeO DMT that is in a benzoate salt that you can have as a nasal spray. A nasal spray allows you to have extremely precise and controlled dosage, which is great for research and scientific usage. This seems like a very wise investment, especially given that 5-MeO DMT has had some trials that are proven to aid in depression, given that the primary agonist works on your 5-HT1A receptors, which is a serotonin receptor. Let's get into it. I would like to tell you the difference between 5-MeO DMT and N DMT chemically, and how the compound looks, and even the pieces of that said compound are extremely similar. But there's a one key difference, which is the 5-methoxy group that is on 5-MeO DMT, which N DMT does not have, which makes it extremely different with how your body interacts with this substance. The two main receptors that I will be talking about are your 5-HT1A receptors and your 5-HT2A receptors. These are both receptors that are agonized or partially agonized with serotonin-based hallucinogenics. Okay. And there's a key difference with 5-MeO DMT compared to all other serotonin-based hallucinogenics, or the classical ones. Let's get into the difference of 5-MeO DMT and N DMT. First, I will begin with N DMT. N DMT is the compound that is found in the ayahuasca brew, where in the ayahuasca brew, there's also other plants that are inhibitors. So without these inhibitors, N DMT lasts quite a short time in your body, about 30 to 40 minutes, where the peak is even less, maybe 15 minutes, depending on how each individual metabolizes it and their subjective experience. But when you add this inhibitor, especially upon ingestion, when you're drinking this beverage instead of inhalation, so an inhibitor is a substance that blocks the creation of an enzyme that breaks down your serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine, and epinephrine in your body. I believe those are the main four. You can feel free to correct me. So given that, it prolongs the experience that is in your body. This is also a very heavy load on your body as well, which is why precautions are needed, especially when taking an inhibitor. It's something to keep in mind. And the difference between 5-MeO DMT and N DMT is that N DMT primarily agonizes your 5-HT2A receptors, just like all other classic psychedelics. However, LSD is also an exception, where it agonizes your 5-HT1A receptors and 5-HT2A receptors quite intensely as well. But the thing is that with 5-MeO DMT, it has an extremely high affinity for your 5-HT1A receptors, where it has a much weaker affinity for your 5-HT2A receptors, where your 5-HT1A receptors are there for mood regulation and also act as an anxiolytic, which is why there are some clinical studies that say it can act as an antidepressant, right? Where 5-MeO DMT has quite a low affinity for your 5-HT2A receptors, which is more within your dream state, your visual cortex, which is where you get all of the vivid hallucinations. So in contrast to 5-MeO DMT with N DMT, N DMT has an extremely high affinity for your 5-HT2A receptors with a much lighter, still quite high, but a much lighter affinity for your 5-HT1A receptors, which is why you get profound and very intense visuals with N DMT. Where with 5-MeO DMT, you don't get intense visuals. It's more of a whiteout or some light geometric patterns. You dissolve. I would like to introduce something to you called the Ki value, or the inhibition constant. So the higher the number, the more of said ligand that you need to bind to a said or specific receptor in your nervous system. For example, and we're going to be comparing 5-HT2A and 5-HT1A receptors here. With N DMT, and I'm just going off by memory here, with N DMT, it has a very high affinity for your 5-HT2A receptors. It needs also, we're going to be measuring this inhibition constant in nanomolars. So this is a very, very tiny amount of said substance that is required to bind to said receptors in the brain and nervous system. I'm doing this by memory. Bear with me. I'm just going to be giving you some ranges here that will give you an idea of how receptive each compound is to said receptor. For example, N DMT to your 5-HT2A receptors needs a very small concentration to bind to said receptor. Let's say around 2 to 10 nanomolars of concentration to bind to said receptor for your 5-HT2A, right? This is for your visuals, the amplified mood, this kind of sensory experience. We're comparing this with 5-MeO-DMT. It has a nanomolar concentration in the hundreds to even over 1,000. So you need 1,000 of said compound in concentration to bind to one receptor. So imagine you have this crowding of chemicals that are all kind of pushing or squeezing into the space, and then eventually one fits on. So the lower you have, the less concentration that you need to bind to said receptor. So now let's change it. Let's look at your 5-HT1A receptors, where with N DMT, it has a nanomolar concentration of around 10 to the hundreds. I believe it's around 100 to 150 that it can get up to. But here's where the unique thing comes in, okay? This is the unique part. Ignore everything else, if anything. But with 5-MeO-DMT, you only need a nanomolar concentration of around 1.5 nanomolars. I believe that was the lowest that was ever recorded. So you have to imagine that one little piece of this compound will just instantly bind to your receptor without there being a need for a huge influx of this compound to be within your body. So it doesn't need a mass to push almost into this receptor. It just finds its way and just falls in and just connects. Boom. It's in. We're live, baby. So given that it has an extremely high affinity for your 5-HT1A receptors and quite a low affinity for your 5-HT2A receptors, it gets rid of the whole visual hallucination aspect and is quite fixated on your anxiolytic receptor, your 5-HT1A receptor, which allows this substance to be utilized in a way that is quite surgical and specific to reduce anxiety without getting the full visual hallucination factor. Of course, with even a small amount of 5-MeO-DMT, you dissolve. You just, you become one with the universe. There is no separation. But in small quantities, you don't necessarily have to experience that. With controlled quantities, it can be used as an antidepressant. And this is why Eli Lilly has invested this money into it, because it has that much promise. It's a very surgical and specific tool that isn't very invasive on your body. What a gift. And I hope that you learned something new.
Here, I'm going to do those introductions that everyone else does. Hi, I'm a psychology lover and enjoyer.